May 7th, 1915. Off the coast of Ireland, the RMS Lusitania, the fastest, most luxurious ocean liner in the world, sinks in just 18 minutes. 1,198 people die, including 128 Americans. Bodies wash ashore for weeks, children clutching dolls, women still wearing their jewelry, men in evening dress, frozen in the moment they realized escape was impossible. This wasn't just a shipwreck. This was the most successful propaganda operation of World War I. A disaster so perfectly timed, so politically convenient, so shrouded in official lies that it would drag America into a war its people desperately wanted to avoid. The Lusitania was marketed as unsinkable, faster than any German U-boat, protected by the British Royal Navy. Her passengers believed they were safe. They were wrong about all of it. At her peak, in 1907, she was the largest ship afloat, 787 feet long, 31,550 tons of British engineering superiority. She could cross the Atlantic in 5 days when competitors needed 7. First-class passengers dined under gilded ceilings in rooms modeled after Versailles. Third-class travelers got better conditions than most hotels. The Lusitania represented everything the British Empire claimed to be: powerful, civilized, invincible. But beneath the luxury, the Lusitania was built for war. Her blueprints included gun mounts. Her cargo holds could carry munitions. The British Admiralty had subsidized her construction with one condition: in wartime, she would become a military asset. On May 1st, 1915, the Lusitania left New York for Liverpool with 1,959 people aboard and a cargo manifest that the British government would spend decades hiding. German intelligence knew what she was carrying. The British Admiralty knew German U-boats were hunting her. And the passengers? They knew nothing. So how does the world's most famous luxury liner become a weapon of war, then a propaganda tool, then a lie that lasts a century? Chapter 1. The Speed Record. The story begins in 1,903 inches, the offices of the Cunard Steamship Company in Liverpool. Cunard had dominated Atlantic passenger service for half a century, but they were losing. The Germans were coming. The Hamburg America Line and Norddeutscher Lloyd were building massive new ships. The Kaiser Wilhelm II and Deutschland were breaking speed records. German liners were stealing Cunard's wealthiest passengers, the ones who paid premium fares for the fastest crossing. Worse, these German ships were a source of national pride, symbols of German industrial might that made Britain look slow and outdated. The British government understood what was happening. Control of the Atlantic wasn't just about passenger service. It was about imperial communications, military transport, and national prestige. If Germany dominated the ocean, they were challenging British naval supremacy itself. So, Whitehall made Cunard an offer. The government would provide a loan of £2.6 million, equivalent to about £340 million today, to build 2 new superliners. In exchange, Cunard would guarantee these ships could be converted for military use. They would be designed to carry guns. Their hulls would be reinforced for potential naval service. And in wartime, the Admiralty could requisition them immediately. Cunard agreed. In 1904, they laid down 2 keels at John Brown and Company in Clydebank, Scotland. The ships would be named Lusitania and Mauritania after Roman provinces in North Africa. They would be the largest, fastest, most powerful passenger ships ever built. The design was radical. Instead of the traditional triple expansion steam engines, they would use steam turbines, a newer technology that was more powerful and more reliable. 25 Scotch boilers would feed 4 direct-drive Parsons turbines, generating 76,000 horsepower. Top speed, 26 knots, fast enough to outrun any warship afloat. The dimensions were staggering: 787 feet long, 88 feet wide, 60 feet from keel to boat deck. Gross tonnage, 31,550. She had 7 decks, 2,198 beds, and could carry 2,198 passengers, plus 850 crew. The hull was divided into 175 watertight compartments. The ship could supposedly survive the flooding of any 3 adjacent compartments and still make it to port. Designers called her practically unsinkable, a phrase that would haunt them. On June 7, 1906, the Lusitania slid down the ways at Clydebank. 20,000 spectators watched. The launch took 45 seconds from release to water. Mary, Lady Inverclyde, wife of Cunard's chairman, smashed a bottle of wine against the bow. The Lusitania had arrived. Fitting out took another year. The interiors were designed to overwhelm. First-class dining rooms featured carved mahogany, gilded moldings, stained glass dome ceilings inspired by the Palace of Versailles. The lounge mimicked an 18th-century French chateau. The smoking room used Italian Renaissance styling with mother-of-pearl inlays. Second class on the Lusitania was better than first class on most competitors. Third class, traditionally cramped and unsanitary, was revolutionary. Passengers got real cabins instead of dormitory-style berths. The dining rooms had proper tables and chairs. There were bathrooms with running water. For immigrants fleeing Europe, this was luxury they'd never experienced. The maiden voyage departed Liverpool on September 7, 1907. 5 days, 54 minutes to New York. Average speed, 23.99 knots. The Lusitania had won the Blue Riband, the unofficial prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing. The press celebrated. The British Empire still ruled the waves. The Germans had been humbled. Passengers booked months in advance to sail on the fastest ship in the world. But speed came with costs. The turbines consumed 1,000 tons of coal per day at full speed. At cruising speed, about 850 tons. Each crossing burned 15,000 pounds in fuel, and that was before accounting for labor, maintenance, and supplies. The Lusitania was spectacularly expensive to operate. Cunard didn't care. She was a prestige vessel, a floating advertisement for British superiority. Profitability mattered less than perception. The Lusitania proved that Britain still led the world in maritime technology. What passengers didn't know was that hidden in the blueprints were mounting points for 12 6-inch naval guns. The reinforced decks could support heavy artillery. The coal bunkers along the hull provided additional armor against torpedo attack. This wasn't just a passenger liner. She was an armed merchant cruiser in waiting, designed from conception to become a warship when needed. Chapter 2. The Conversion. When war broke out in August 1914, the British Admiralty immediately requisitioned dozens of merchant ships for military use. Fast liners like the Lusitania were perfect candidates for armed merchant cruisers. They could chase down German raiders, escort convoys, and patrol shipping lanes. The Maritime, Lusitania's sister ship, was converted into a troop transport. The Olympic, Titanic's surviving sister, became a hospital ship. Dozens of other liners were fitted with guns and pressed into naval service. But the Lusitania? She kept running civilian passenger service. Officially. The truth was more complicated. In November 1914, the Admiralty quietly listed the Lusitania in the Naval Register as an armed merchant cruiser. British law required this designation for any ship that might carry military cargo or be used for naval purposes. It also made her a legitimate military target under international law. The Lusitania never mounted guns visibly, but her cargo manifest started including items that had nothing to do with passenger service. Rifle ammunition, artillery shells, fuses, military equipment destined for British forces in France. On the official manifests, these items were listed as general cargo or non-hazardous materials. But German intelligence wasn't fooled. They had agents watching the piers in New York. They saw crates being loaded into the Lusitania's cargo holds. They photographed longshoremen handling ammunition boxes stamped with military markings. The German government filed formal complaints with the U.S. State Department. American law prohibited the transport of war materials on passenger ships. The Neutrality Acts were clear. You couldn't mix civilians and munitions. It was illegal, immoral, and insanely dangerous. The British government denied everything. The cargo was harmless, they insisted. Just general supplies. Nothing explosive. Nothing that could endanger passengers. The denials were lies. But American officials accepted them. The Wilson administration didn't want to know the truth. Meanwhile, German U-boats were transforming naval warfare. These submarines could sink ships without warning, violating the traditional prize rules that required warships to search merchant vessels before attacking. But Germany argued that Britain's naval blockade of German ports was itself illegal, starving German civilians. Unrestricted submarine warfare was retaliation. In February 1915, Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone. Any ship flying a British flag could be sunk without warning. Even neutral ships risked attack if they entered the zone. It was a desperate gamble. Germany had fewer than 30 operational U-boats. They couldn't possibly enforce a total blockade, but the threat alone might force Britain to negotiate. The Lusitania kept sailing. Cunard needed the revenue. The British government needed the propaganda value of showing that German threats wouldn't stop British civilian life. And passengers kept booking passage, convinced that the Lusitania was too fast to be caught and too important to be attacked. They were wrong on both counts. In April 1915, the German embassy in Washington took out newspaper advertisements, warning Americans not to sail on British ships. The notice appeared in 50 newspapers on May 1st, the day the Lusitania was scheduled to depart New York. Notice: travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles. That, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain, or any of her allies, are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on the ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. The warning ran right next to Cunard's advertisement for the Lusitania's sailing. Passengers saw it. Some canceled their bookings, but most dismissed it as German propaganda. The Lusitania was too fast. The British Navy would provide escorts. Germany wouldn't dare sink a ship carrying American citizens. All of these assumptions were false. For 7 years, the Lusitania dominated the Atlantic. Then on August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and everything changed. Chapter 3. The Final Voyage. May 1st, 1915. Pier 54 inches, Manhattan. The Lusitania loomed over the Hudson River, black hull gleaming, 4 massive funnels smoking as the boilers built steam. Passengers began boarding at 10 a.m. First-class passengers entered through a grand entrance, greeted by stewards in white jackets who escorted them to palatial staterooms. Charles Frohman, the famous theatrical producer, booked one of the regal suites. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in America, traveled in luxury. Elbert Hubbard, the writer and philosopher, brought his wife Alice for a European lecture tour. Second and third class boarded separately, through side gangways that led to their own sections of the ship. Among them were hundreds of British citizens returning home, many of them war workers or military personnel in civilian clothes, families with children, elderly couples, a Canadian university rowing crew heading to compete in England. As passengers settled in, longshoremen loaded cargo. The official manifest listed mundane items: beef, cheese, copper, furs, automobile parts, but they also loaded cargo that didn't appear on any public documents. From the Remington Small Arms Company, 4,200,000 rounds of 303 rifle ammunition. Not cartridges, just bullets and powder, stored separately to comply with technical definitions of ammunition. From Bethlehem Steel, 1,250 cases of empty shrapnel shells, 18 cases of fuses, various military equipment, spare parts, and supplies for British forces in France. And then there was the mystery cargo. Historical records show that additional materials were loaded without proper documentation. Some researchers claim they included gun cotton, an explosive used in naval mines. Others point to aluminum powder, which combined with shrapnel shell casings could create devastating secondary explosions. The truth is still debated. What's certain is that the Lusitania was carrying enough war materials to make her a legitimate military target under international law, and the British government knew it. At 12:30 p.m., the Lusitania's horn sounded 3 times. Tugs pulled her away from the pier. Thousands of spectators lined the waterfront, waving handkerchiefs and American flags. The passengers waved back, excited for the crossing. As the ship steamed down the Hudson toward the Atlantic, a passenger named Ogden Hammond reportedly told a companion, "I wonder what the Germans will do to us." His companion laughed. "They wouldn't dare." The Lusitania carried 1,959 people, 1,257 passengers, and 702 crew. Among the passengers were 159 Americans, including 31 infants and children. The U.S. He was still neutral. The Germans wouldn't attack a ship carrying American citizens, would they? The crossing was uneventful for the first 5 days. Passengers enjoyed meals in the dining rooms, played cards in the lounges, strolled the promenades. First-class travelers barely noticed they were at sea. The ship moved so smoothly that glasses didn't slide on tables. Captain William Turner, 58 years old, had commanded the Lusitania for 2 years. He was experienced, competent, and following orders from the Admiralty. Those orders were confusing and contradictory. On May 5th, the Lusitania entered the war zone around Britain. The Admiralty sent a warning: German submarines active in the Irish Sea. Ships should stay in the middle of the channel, travel at high speed, and zigzag to avoid torpedoes. Turner followed some of these instructions, but not all. He slowed the ship from 21 knots to 18 knots to conserve coal. Cunard's accountants were concerned about fuel costs. He didn't zigzag consistently because it consumed more fuel and the visibility was good. He steamed close to the Irish coast, within 12 miles, because it was the standard route and he was used to it. On the morning of May 7th, the Admiralty sent additional warnings. Submarine activity reported 20 miles south of Cunard light vessel, off the Irish coast. Submarines last seen headed west. Turner noted the message but didn't change course or increase speed. He had received dozens of submarine warnings over the previous year. None had resulted in attacks on passenger liners. The Germans might threaten, but they wouldn't actually torpedo a ship full of civilians. The political consequences would be catastrophic. What Turner didn't know was that the German submarine U-20, commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Walther Schwieger, was running low on fuel and torpedoes. Schwieger had already sunk 3 ships earlier in the patrol. He had 3 torpedoes left and barely enough diesel to reach home port. Schwieger had orders to sink British shipping in the Irish Sea, but he was under strict instructions to avoid attacking passenger liners unless they were confirmed to be carrying military cargo or troops. The German Naval Command didn't want to provoke America into entering the war. On the morning of May 7th, fog along the Irish coast kept U-20 submerged. Schwieger couldn't see targets. By early afternoon, the fog cleared. At 1:20 p.m., Schwieger raised the periscope. 8 miles away, coming directly toward him, was the unmistakable silhouette of a 4-funneled ocean liner. Schwieger couldn't believe his luck. The ship was traveling slowly, not zigzagging, and coming close enough for an easy shot. Through the periscope, he could see passengers on deck. He could see the name painted on the bow, Lusitania. He had to make a decision. This was clearly a civilian passenger liner. But it was also listed as an armed merchant cruiser. German intelligence had confirmed she was carrying munitions. Under the laws of war, she was a legitimate target. Schwieger made his choice. He ordered the submarine into attack position. At 2:10 p.m., the Lusitania was 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale, Ireland. Passengers were finishing lunch. Some were on deck, enjoying the sunny afternoon. Children played on the promenade. Schwieger gave the order. The torpedo launched from a distance of about 700 meters. 18-year-old Leslie Morton, a lookout on the Lusitania's starboard bow, spotted the white streak in the water. He shouted a warning, but it was too late. The torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side, just below the bridge. The explosion tore open the hull. Water flooded in instantly. Then, seconds later, a second explosion, far more powerful than the first, ripped through the ship. Eyewitnesses described it as massive, sending debris and coal dust hundreds of feet into the air. The second explosion broke windows, buckled decks, and killed passengers below decks instantly. What caused that second explosion? The debate still rages. The British claimed it was a boiler explosion, but the boilers were in a different part of the ship. Some historians believe the torpedo struck near the ammunition storage, causing the 4.2 million rounds to detonate. Others point to the aluminum powder or gun cotton in the undocumented cargo. The truth probably died with the ship. What's certain is that the second explosion doomed the Lusitania. Captain Turner immediately ordered the lifeboats lowered, but the ship was listing so severely to starboard that half the lifeboats couldn't be launched. They swung inward, away from the water, useless. On the port side, boats launched but crashed into the hull as the ship rolled. Passengers fell into the sea. The Lusitania was sinking fast. Water rushed through the torpedo hole and the massive gash from the second explosion. The bow dipped lower and lower. Furniture slid forward. People struggled to climb the tilting decks. In third class, passengers were trapped. The watertight doors had sealed automatically, preventing them from reaching the lifeboats. They pounded on the doors, screaming. Nobody came. 18 minutes after the torpedo hit, the Lusitania's bow went under. The stern rose into the air, propellers dripping. The forward funnel collapsed, crushing passengers in the water. Then the ship slid beneath the surface. 1,198 people died. 128 were Americans. Chapter 4. The Rescue. The Lusitania sank in 300 feet of water, 11 miles off the Irish coast. Survivors floated in the frigid Atlantic, clinging to wreckage and overturned lifeboats. The water temperature was 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Without rescue, hypothermia would kill them within hours. British fishing boats from Queenstown, now Cobb, responded to distress calls. The first arrived 90 minutes after the sinking. What they found was a nightmare. Bodies floated everywhere. Children in life jackets face down, women still wearing their jewelry drowned, men in evening dress frozen. Lifeboats drifted upside down with passengers trapped underneath, suffocated or drowned. The sea was littered with debris, deck chairs, luggage, clothing, and the wreckage of a great ship. The fishing boats pulled survivors from the water. 761 people were rescued, many of them barely alive. They arrived in Queenstown in shock, wrapped in blankets, crying uncontrollably. The dead washed ashore for weeks. The old head of Kinsale Beach became a morgue. Local villagers walked the strand every morning, collecting bodies. They laid them out in warehouses and church halls. Families came to identify loved ones, searching through rows of corpses for familiar faces. The children were the hardest to see. They'd been dressed in their best clothes for the voyage. Now they were waterlogged, skin gray, eyes open. Irish women wept as they prepared the bodies for burial. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in America, gave his life jacket to a woman with a baby. His body was never found. Charles Frohman, the theatrical producer, was last seen on deck with other first-class passengers. A survivor reported hearing him quote, "Peter Pan, why fear death? It is the most beautiful adventure in life." His body washed ashore 3 weeks later. Elbert Hubbard and his wife Alice went down together, arms linked. Neither body was recovered. The human toll was staggering, but the political consequences were even greater. Chapter 5. The Propaganda War. News of the sinking reached London on the afternoon of May 7th. The Admiralty knew immediately that this would be a propaganda disaster for Germany. They also knew they needed to control the narrative before questions started being asked about why the Lusitania was carrying munitions and why the Royal Navy failed to protect her. Within hours, the British government launched what would become one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in history. First, they emphasized American deaths. Of the 1,198 dead, 128 were Americans, including women and children. The British press ran photos of American victims, focusing on infants and young mothers. Headlines screamed, "Germans murder American babies." Second, they suppressed all information about the cargo. The ammunition, the shrapnel shells, the fuses, everything disappeared from official reports. The manifest submitted to Parliament listed only innocent commercial goods. Reporters who asked about munitions were told the story was German propaganda. Third, they blamed Captain Turner. The Admiralty held a secret inquiry and concluded that Turner had ignored orders to zigzag and stay in the middle of the channel. He was made the scapegoat, quietly removed from command, and forbidden from speaking publicly about the Admiralty's contradictory instructions. Fourth, and most importantly, they commissioned medals and posters that depicted the sinking as a war crime. The Germans had murdered civilians in cold blood. This wasn't legitimate naval warfare. It was barbarism. The propaganda worked brilliantly. In America, public opinion turned violently anti-German. Newspapers ran editorials demanding war. Theodore Roosevelt called the sinking piracy on a vaster scale than the worst pirates of history. He wrote, "We owe it to humanity to act." President Woodrow Wilson faced enormous pressure to declare war. But he resisted. Wilson had campaigned on keeping America out of the European conflict. He believed neutrality was not just good policy, but a moral obligation. He sent strong diplomatic notes to Germany, demanding they end unrestricted submarine warfare and pay reparations for American deaths. Germany responded with a mixture of defiance and regret. They argued that the Lusitania was a legitimate military target because she was carrying munitions and listed as an armed merchant cruiser. They published evidence of the cargo and pointed to the British Admiralty's own records classifying her as a naval vessel. But they also expressed regret for the American deaths. The German government hadn't wanted to provoke America. Sinking the Lusitania was a tactical success, but a strategic disaster. It turned neutral American opinion against Germany and gave Britain a propaganda victory they'd exploit for the rest of the war. The sinking didn't immediately bring America into WWI. Wilson kept the U.S. neutral for another 2 years, but the Lusitania planted the seed. It made Americans see Germany as brutal and uncivilized. It made intervention thinkable. In Britain, the propaganda was even more intense. The Lusitania became a symbol of German atrocity. Recruitment posters showed the sinking ship with the caption, "Remember the Lusitania." Enlistment numbers spiked. Young men who'd hesitated to join up now enlisted, driven by rage over murdered civilians. Meanwhile, uncomfortable questions were buried. Why was a passenger liner carrying military cargo? Why did the Admiralty fail to provide naval escorts, despite knowing U-boats were active in the area? Why did they send confusing orders to Captain Turner? Why was there a massive second explosion if the ship was only carrying harmless cargo? These questions would remain buried for decades. The British government classified all documents related to the Lusitania's cargo and the Admiralty's actions. They wouldn't be released until the 1970s and 1980s. By then, the official story had been repeated so many times it had become accepted history. The truth was messier and more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Germany had committed a war crime by sinking a passenger liner without warning. But Britain had endangered those passengers by using a civilian ship to transport munitions. Both sides lied. Both sides manipulated the tragedy for propaganda purposes, and the passengers paid the price. Chapter 6. The Conspiracy Theories. In the years following the sinking, conspiracy theories multiplied. Some were absurd. Others pointed to uncomfortable truths that governments wanted hidden. The most persistent theory was that Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, deliberately allowed the Lusitania to be sunk to bring America into the war. The logic went like this. Churchill knew the ship was carrying munitions. He knew U-boats were hunting her. He refused to provide naval escorts. He sent confusing orders to Captain Turner that ensured the Lusitania would be in the danger zone at the worst possible time. Then he sat back and waited for Germany to hand Britain the perfect propaganda tool. There's circumstantial evidence for this theory. Churchill had written privately about the need to bring America into the war. He understood that Britain couldn't win without American support, and he certainly exploited the Lusitania's sinking for maximum propaganda effect. But there's no smoking gun proving deliberate sabotage. The Admiralty's failures were more likely the result of incompetence, institutional arrogance, and resource constraints than conspiracy. British naval intelligence was tracking multiple U-boats. They couldn't provide escorts for every merchant ship. Their communications were bureaucratic and contradictory. Turner received confusing orders because the Admiralty itself was confused and overwhelmed. A second theory focused on the second explosion. If the Lusitania was carrying only rifle ammunition and empty shrapnel shells, what caused the massive secondary blast that doomed the ship? The official British explanation was a boiler explosion, but naval architects and engineers who studied the wreck found this impossible. The boilers were in the wrong location. A torpedo hit near the bow wouldn't have reached them. In the 1970s, when British government documents were finally declassified, researchers discovered that the cargo manifest had been falsified. The ammunition listed as non-explosive was actually high-explosive munitions. The empty shrapnel shells were filled with explosive charges. The cargo holds contained aluminum powder and other materials that could cause secondary explosions. Divers who explored the wreck in the 1980s and 1990s found evidence of massive internal explosions. The hull was blown outward from inside, not just punctured by the torpedo. Something in the cargo holds had detonated. The British government still maintains that the second explosion was coal dust in the bunkers igniting. This is theoretically possible, but requires very specific conditions that probably didn't exist. Most independent researchers now believe the torpedo struck the ammunition storage, causing the catastrophic secondary blast. A third theory claimed the Lusitania was actually armed with hidden guns. German propaganda insisted she was an armed merchant cruiser with concealed weapons. After the war, some German sailors claimed they'd been shown photos of the Lusitania's gun mounts. This theory is probably false. No credible evidence of mounted guns has been found. The Lusitania was designed to carry guns if needed, but they were never installed. Calling her an armed merchant cruiser was technically accurate because of the military cargo and Admiralty registration, but misleading because she carried no actual armaments. The problem with conspiracy theories is that they obscure real conspiracies. The British government did lie about the cargo. They did suppress evidence. They did manipulate the tragedy for propaganda purposes. These aren't theories. They're documented facts revealed when classified files were released decades later. The Lusitania wasn't sunk as part of a conspiracy to drag America into war. But the sinking was exploited with cold calculation by both the British and German governments, neither of which cared much about the truth or the victims. Chapter 7. The Legal Battle. In the years following the sinking, survivors and families of the dead filed thousands of lawsuits. They sued Cunard for negligence. They sued the German government for war crimes. They sued the British government for failing to protect the ship. The legal battles dragged on for decades, revealing uncomfortable truths both sides wanted hidden. The cases against Cunard focused on several key failures. Why did the ship sail into a war zone with known U-boat activity? Why was she carrying military cargo in violation of American neutrality laws? Why were passengers not informed of the dangers? Cunard's defense was simple. They were following British Admiralty orders. The ship was requisitioned for government service. The cargo was loaded under government supervision. The route and sailing schedule were determined by the Admiralty. Captain Turner was following orders. This defense essentially admitted that the Lusitania was being used for military purposes, which undermined British propaganda claims that she was an innocent civilian vessel. The courts found themselves in an impossible position. If they ruled in favor of the passengers, they'd be confirming German claims that the Lusitania was a legitimate military target. If they ruled for Cunard, they'd be saying the company had no duty to protect civilian passengers from known dangers. The compromise was typical of legal maneuvering. Cunard settled most cases for nominal amounts, without admitting liability. The British government quietly paid compensation to some American families, framed as ex gratia payments rather than legal damages. The cases against Germany were even more complicated. Under international law at the time, submarine warfare existed in a gray area. Traditional prize rules required warships to stop, search, and board merchant vessels before sinking them. But submarines couldn't surface safely to do this. If they tried, the merchant ship could radio for help, or even ram the submarine. Germany argued that Britain's naval blockade had already violated international law by starving German civilians. Unrestricted submarine warfare was retaliation in kind, and the Lusitania specifically was carrying military cargo, making her a legitimate target. The legal principle was clear. You can't use civilian shields to protect military cargo. If the Lusitania was carrying munitions, she lost her protection as a civilian vessel. Passengers who chose to travel on her accepted the risk. But the moral principle was equally clear. You don't torpedo passenger ships without warning, giving civilians time to evacuate. Even if the Lusitania was a legitimate target, the method of attack was unconscionable. In 1917, when America finally entered WWI, Congress passed legislation allowing American citizens to sue the German government for war damages. The Lusitania cases became part of a massive claims tribunal that eventually awarded $2.5 million to American victims' families. Germany paid nothing until the 1920s, and even then, only a fraction of the awarded amounts. The most revealing legal battle was the British government's inquiry into Captain Turner's conduct. The Admiralty held secret hearings, classified the transcripts, and blamed Turner for ignoring orders. But when those transcripts were finally released in the 1960s and 72nds, they showed that Turner had followed most of his orders and that the Admiralty's instructions were contradictory and confusing. Turner was told to stay in the middle of the channel but also to stay close to shore for protection. He was ordered to travel at high speed but also to conserve coal. He was instructed to zigzag but also to maintain schedule. These orders couldn't all be followed simultaneously. Turner did his best with impossible instructions. The Admiralty scapegoated Turner to hide their own failures. They'd known U-20 was hunting in the Irish Sea. They'd received intelligence about the submarine's position. They could have routed the Lusitania farther out to sea or delayed her arrival until the U-boat moved on. They chose not to, possibly because they didn't want to disrupt schedules, possibly because they didn't take the threat seriously enough. When the truth came out decades later, Turner was dead, and the Admiralty officials who'd blamed him were dead. Nobody was held accountable. The legal battles produced settlements, but not justice. The truth came out, but too late to matter. Chapter 8. The Wreck. The Lusitania lies 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale in 300 feet of water, deeper than most recreational divers can reach safely. For decades, the wreck was undisturbed, a grave site protected by depth and currents. In the 1960s, John Light, an American diver, led the first expedition to the wreck. Using primitive diving equipment and dangerous decompression schedules, Light's team photographed the wreck and recovered artifacts. They found the ship lying on her starboard side, the side the torpedo struck, with massive damage to the hull. Light's most significant finding was the extent of the internal explosion damage. The hull was blown outward from inside, not just punctured inward by the torpedo. Something inside the ship had exploded with enormous force, far greater than a single torpedo could produce. Light believed this proved the Lusitania was carrying high explosives in violation of international law and passenger safety regulations. He wrote a book making these claims, which the British government dismissed as sensationalism. In 1982, Robert Ballard, famous for discovering the Titanic, surveyed the Lusitania using remote underwater vehicles. Ballard's expedition confirmed Light's findings. The damage pattern was consistent with a massive internal explosion, not just torpedo impact. Ballard also found that the ship was deteriorating rapidly. The wreck had been sitting in salt water for 67 years. The steel was corroding. Decks were collapsing. The bow section had partially broken away. Within another 50 years, the wreck might be nothing but scattered debris. The Irish government designated the wreck a war grave and prohibited artifact recovery, but this didn't stop salvage operations. Over the years, various expeditions have illegally recovered items from the Lusitania: dishes, portholes, pieces of the ship's bell, even human bones. The most controversial expedition was in the 1990s, when a team using saturation diving techniques spent weeks on the wreck. They were looking for specific evidence: the cargo holds where the munitions were stored. They wanted to prove conclusively what the Lusitania was carrying. They found wreckage of the cargo areas, but nothing conclusive. The deterioration was too advanced. The compartments had collapsed. Whatever cargo remained was buried under tons of twisted metal and silt. They did find evidence of copper and brass fragments consistent with artillery shell casings, but not enough to prove the cargo manifests were falsified. The British government still refuses to release all documents related to the Lusitania's final cargo. They claim national security concerns, which is absurd 110 years after the sinking. The real reason is probably embarrassment. Admitting that Britain knowingly transported munitions on a passenger liner would tarnish the propaganda narrative that sustained public support for WWI. Today, the wreck is slowly disappearing. Each year, more of the structure collapses. In 2019, a diving expedition found that one of the 4 funnels had finally collapsed completely. The stern section is separating from the midships. The wreck won't last another century. Someday, the Lusitania will be nothing but a debris field. The physical evidence of what she carried, what caused the catastrophic second explosion, and what really happened will be lost forever. Only the arguments will remain. Chapter 9. The American Entry. The Lusitania didn't immediately bring America into World War I, but it made intervention inevitable. The sinking planted a seed that grew over the next 2 years until Wilson had no choice. After the sinking, German submarine warfare paused briefly. They didn't want to provoke America further, but by 1916, Germany was desperate. The war had stalemated. Millions were dead on the Western Front, but the lines hadn't moved. Germany's only hope was to starve Britain into submission by cutting off Atlantic supply lines. In February 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. All ships in the war zone, including American vessels, would be sunk without warning. The German High Command knew this would bring America into the war. They gambled that they could force British surrender before American troops arrived in significant numbers. They gambled wrong. On the 6th of April, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. President Wilson, who had campaigned on keeping America out of the war, asked Congress for a declaration. His speech referenced German submarine warfare and specifically mentioned the Lusitania. Vessels of every kind, whatever their flag, their character, their cargo, their destination, their errand, have been ruthlessly sent to the bottom without warning and without thought of help or mercy for those on board, Wilson said. Even hospital ships and ships carrying relief to the sorely bereaved and stricken people of Belgium have been sunk with the same reckless lack of compassion or of principle. The Lusitania was implicit in every word. The image of drowned children and murdered civilians had been seared into American consciousness. The propaganda had worked. American entry into WWI turned the tide. By 1918, millions of fresh American troops were arriving in France. Germany, already exhausted, couldn't match this new influx of men and materiel. On the 11th of November, 1918, Germany signed the armistice. The war killed 20 million people. It destroyed empires, redrew borders, and created the conditions for an even more catastrophic conflict 2 decades later. The Lusitania was one small tragedy in a war of unprecedented horror. But it was the tragedy that made American intervention possible, and American intervention decided the war's outcome. Would America have entered WWI without the Lusitania? Probably, eventually. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare threatened American shipping directly. The Zimmermann telegram, revealing German plans to support Mexico in reconquering American territory, enraged public opinion. Britain and France owed American banks billions in loans that would default if they lost. But the Lusitania made intervention emotionally acceptable. It gave Wilson moral cover for breaking his neutrality promises. It allowed Americans to believe they were fighting for civilization against barbarism rather than to protect financial investments and imperial interests. The sinking was a turning point, not because it changed strategic realities, but because it changed how Americans saw the war. Chapter 10. The Memory. In Queenstown Cove, Ireland, there's a memorial to the Lusitania victims. It's a modest monument, a stone column in a park overlooking the harbor where rescue ships brought the survivors and the dead. Every year, on May 7th, a small ceremony is held. Fewer people attend each year. The last survivors died decades ago. Their children and grandchildren are elderly now. Soon the Lusitania will slip from living memory into pure history. In Britain, the ship is remembered as a symbol of German atrocity, though that narrative has been complicated by revelations about the munitions cargo. The Remember the Lusitania recruitment posters are now museum pieces, recognized as propaganda rather than objective truth. In Germany, the Lusitania is a more ambiguous memory. She was a legitimate military target carrying munitions into a war zone, but the method of attack, torpedoing without warning, was still wrong. Both things can be true simultaneously. In America, the Lusitania is mostly forgotten. It's taught in schools as part of WWI history, but it doesn't have the cultural weight it once did. The Titanic, which sank 3 years earlier, is more famous, more romanticized, more embedded in popular culture. The Lusitania killed more people, but failed to capture the same mythic status. Perhaps that's because the Titanic's tragedy was clean, hubris and nature, with no one deliberately trying to kill anyone. The Lusitania's tragedy is messy, military necessity and propaganda, governments lying, civilians used as shields, no one innocent. The wreck is deteriorating. Within a century, it will be gone. The physical evidence will disappear. We'll be left with contradictory accounts, declassified documents that raise more questions than they answer, and the knowledge that everyone involved lied at least a little. The Lusitania's legacy isn't heroism or villainy. It's the dirty complexity of war, where civilians die for strategic purposes and governments use their deaths for propaganda. It's the gap between official narratives and messy truths. It's the reality that in war, everyone sacrifices moral clarity for tactical advantage. The final reckoning. The Lusitania's dark story isn't about a ship that sank. It's about the gap between what governments tell their people and what actually happened. It's about civilians used as strategic assets without their knowledge or consent. It's about propaganda so effective that it shaped history for a century. From 1907 to 1915, the Lusitania represented the peak of British maritime supremacy. She was fast, luxurious, powerful, everything the empire claimed to be. Then, in 18 minutes, she was gone, taking 1,198 people with her. The ship's destruction changed history. It didn't cause America's entry into WWI, but it made intervention politically possible. The propaganda campaign that followed demonstrated how emotional narratives could overwhelm factual complexity. The lies told about the cargo and the Admiralty's failures lasted for generations. Today, the wreck is deteriorating in 300 feet of water. Soon, the physical evidence will be gone. We'll be left with contradictory documents, declassified files that raise more questions than they answer, and the knowledge that everyone involved lied at least a little. The Lusitania's legacy is complicated and uncomfortable. Germany committed a war crime by torpedoing a passenger liner without warning, but Britain endangered those passengers by using a civilian ship to transport munitions. Both sides manipulated the tragedy for propaganda purposes. Both sides lied, and the passengers paid with their lives for decisions made by people sitting safely in offices hundreds of miles away. This is the dark story of the Lusitania. Not a simple tragedy of innocent victims and evil perpetrators, but a complex catastrophe where governments prioritize strategy over truth, military necessity over civilian safety, and propaganda over moral clarity. The ship is gone. The passengers are gone. The governments that lied are gone. But the lesson remains. In war, trust nothing you're told. Question every official narrative. Demand accountability immediately, because if you wait for the truth to emerge naturally, everyone responsible will be safely dead. The Lusitania didn't have to sink. Those 1,198 people didn't have to die, but they did, because the people making decisions valued strategic advantage over human life. And then, for a century, those same people and their successors lied about why it happened. That's the dark story. Not the ship that sank, but the lies that followed, and the truth that came too late to matter.